There is a version of the Cold War that most people carry with them, a version built from television footage of missile parades, from photographs of politicians signing treaties in wood-paneled rooms, from the familiar image of a wall coming down while crowds cheered in the cold Berlin night. That version is not exactly wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The Cold War was not mostly peaceful. It was mostly silent. And silence, in the context of thousands of nuclear warheads, maintained in constant readiness, is not the same thing as safety. The distinction between those two words, safety and silence, is where the real history lives, and it is a history that was carefully managed, deliberately obscured, and in many cases actively buried by the institutions that created it. What follows is not a collection of dramatic moments. It is something quieter and in many ways more disturbing. It is an account of systems, programs, projects, and contingency plans that were designed, funded, staffed, and in some cases nearly activated before being reclassified, mothballed, or simply allowed to disappear from the official record. These were not failures of imagination. They were, in most cases, the products of extraordinarily rigorous institutional thinking. Men and women with advanced degrees and security clearances and an acute awareness of what was at stake sat in rooms and designed these things with great care. The problem was not that they were irrational. The problem was that they were entirely rational within a framework that had already accepted the possibility of civilizational collapse as a planning parameter. That is the world this narration inhabits. Not the world of diplomats and summits, but the world of targeting committees and yield calculations and automated response trees and bunkers stocked with enough supplies to last through a nuclear winter that the people doing the stocking were not entirely sure would end. It is a world where the question was never whether catastrophe was possible, but rather how catastrophe could be managed, delayed, or if necessary, survived in some technical sense of the word. Begin with what the public record does not emphasize. The Cold War produced at its peak a combined nuclear arsenal of approximately 70,000 warheads between the United States and the Soviet Union. That number is often cited and rarely processed. 70,000 warheads, each one a discrete engineering achievement, each one connected to a chain of command, each one assigned to a target, each one maintained by technicians who came to work every morning in ordinary uniforms and ordinary states of mind and performed their duties with ordinary professional competence. The ordinariness of it was, in retrospect, one of the most destabilizing features of the entire enterprise. The machinery of extinction was operated by people who ate lunch and complained about paperwork and looked forward to the weekend. Against that backdrop, the 23 programs that follow are not anomalies. They are expressions of the system. They are what institutional logic produces when it is given unlimited funding, absolute secrecy, and a mandate to prepare for outcomes that cannot be named in polite company. Some of them are known today because documents were eventually declassified. Some are known because individuals involved chose late in life to speak. Some are known only in outline, their full details still sealed or destroyed. And some exist in the record in a form that suggests more than it confirms. A kind of bureaucratic silhouette that implies a shape without revealing what cast it. The first of these projects concerns a system that was built to end American civilization on purpose. Not by accident, not as a side effect, but as a deliberate and precisely calculated act, triggered not by human decision, but by the detection of incoming missiles. The United States in the early 1960s faced a problem that had no clean solution. American nuclear forces, if struck first in a massive Soviet attack, might be destroyed on the ground before they could be launched. The solution that emerged from this problem was a family of programs grouped under the concept of launch on warning. And within that family, there existed a specific and largely unacknowledged project tied to the early ballistic missile early warning system, the chain of radar installations built across Canada and Greenland and the United Kingdom to detect Soviet missiles crossing the polar arc. The problem with launch on warning was that it required a decision to be made in minutes. From the detection of an incoming strike to the moment American missiles would need to leave their silos, the window was somewhere between 3 and 15 minutes, depending on the type of attack and the location of the threat. No president could be reliably reached in that window. No chain of command could be fully verified. And so the planners did what planners do. They built procedures designed to function in the absence of the people who were supposed to authorize them. What those procedures looked like in their classified form has never been fully revealed. What is known from partially declassified documents and the accounts of people who worked adjacent to these systems is that the authority to launch, under certain conditions and through certain channels, was distributed in ways that were not publicly acknowledged and were in some cases not acknowledged within the chain of command itself. This is not a story of rogue officers. It is a story of a system that had been designed to function even when its human components were unavailable, and that had therefore quietly transferred authority away from those human components in ways that the human components did not fully understand. The generals and the presidents and the secretaries of defense believed they retained control because the procedures said they retained control. The procedures were accurate as written. What they did not capture was the practical reality of what would happen in the first 12 minutes of a nuclear exchange, when communications would be disrupted and authority would be ambiguous, and the machinery would continue operating according to its own internal logic. The second project is related but distinct. In the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the United States Air Force operated a program known within classified channels by a designation that has been partially released but whose full scope remains unclear. The program involved the pre-delegation of nuclear release authority to field commanders under specific and narrow conditions. The theory was straightforward. If Washington were destroyed in a first strike, someone needed to have the authority to respond. The reality was considerably more complex. The conditions under which pre-delegation applied were defined in documents that were themselves classified, distributed to commanders who were themselves operating under significant communications constraints, and subject to interpretation in circumstances that the document's authors had not fully anticipated. What has emerged from the historical record is that at various points in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the authority to initiate nuclear strikes was held, in practical terms, by officers at multiple levels of the command structure who had not been publicly identified as holding that authority, who were operating under rules of engagement that had not been publicly acknowledged, and who were in some cases unaware of what other officers at similar levels of the hierarchy were authorized to do. The system was not chaotic, it was orderly. But its orderliness was achieved by fragmenting authority in ways that made the overall picture impossible for any single person to hold clearly in mind. There is a third project that belongs in this accounting, one that has received more public attention than most on this list, but whose full dimensions remain inadequately understood. Project Pluto was a nuclear-powered cruise missile program operated by the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory beginning in 1957 and continuing until 1964. The concept behind Project Pluto was straightforward in engineering terms and extraordinary in its implications. A nuclear reactor would be used to heat air directly and expel it as thrust, allowing a cruise missile to fly indefinitely at supersonic speeds at very low altitude, delivering nuclear warheads across a vast range without any of the fuel constraints that limited conventional missiles. The missile that Project Pluto was working toward, a vehicle designated SLAM for Supersonic Low-Altitude Missile, would have been one of the most destructive objects ever built. It would have carried multiple nuclear warheads. It would have flown low enough to evade radar. And because it was nuclear-powered, it would have been able to spend hours or days crisscrossing Soviet territory after delivering its primary warheads, continuing to fly and to irradiate everything beneath its flight path with the unshielded radiation from its reactor core. The engineers at Lawrence Radiation Laboratory understood what they were building. The program documents describe, with clinical precision, the secondary radiological effects of a low-altitude supersonic nuclear reactor traversing populated areas. The program was cancelled not because of its destructive potential, but because ballistic missiles had become sufficiently accurate and reliable to make SLAM redundant. The decision was bureaucratic, not ethical. The technology worked. The concept was sound by the standards of the time. It was simply no longer necessary. What remained was a partially developed system whose underlying technology, the nuclear ramjet, had been successfully tested, and whose full specifications were classified for decades after the program ended. The fourth project in this accounting involves the ocean, which served throughout the Cold War as a domain of extraordinary and largely invisible military activity. The United States Navy, beginning in the early 1960s, operated a series of programs under the broad classification of anti-submarine warfare that involved not merely the detection and tracking of Soviet submarines, but the development of systems capable of destroying them automatically, without real-time human authorization, under defined trigger conditions. The details of these systems have been partially released and extensively redacted, but what is clear from the available record is that the Navy was, at various points, operating autonomous or semi-autonomous kill systems in ocean zones where Soviet submarines regularly operated. The strategic logic was coherent. Soviet submarines carrying ballistic missiles were a second strike threat, and the ability to neutralize them quickly in the opening minutes of a conflict was considered essential. But the practical implications of autonomous kill systems operating in contested ocean space, without reliable communications links to command authority, and in an environment where identification of targets was subject to significant uncertainty, were considerable. There are documented cases from the 1960s and 1970s of American anti-submarine forces making contact with what were classified as definite Soviet submarines in circumstances that came close to triggering engagement. In at least some of these cases, the decision not to engage was made by individual officers acting on their own judgment in the absence of clear guidance, in conditions where their communications were degraded or absent. The fifth project concerns fire, specifically the use of incendiary weapons on a scale that has never been fully acknowledged in the context of Cold War planning. American war planners in the 1950s, building on the experience of the firebombing campaigns of the Second World War, developed contingency plans for the use of large-scale incendiary attacks against Soviet and Chinese cities as a complement to nuclear strikes. These plans were incorporated into the early versions of the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the PSYOP, which was the master nuclear war plan that governed American nuclear forces from 1960 onward. What has emerged from declassified PSYOP documents is that the early versions of the plan allocated nuclear weapons to targets in ways that maximized blast and fire damage simultaneously, that civilian casualties were calculated as a planning metric, and that the numbers involved were of an order that exceeded the casualties of every previous war in human history combined. The specific incendiary planning that paralleled the nuclear planning has been less thoroughly documented in the public record, but what is known is that conventional incendiary capability was maintained as a supplement to nuclear forces throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, and that the targeting lists included civilian infrastructure in ways that would have produced mass civilian casualties as a direct and anticipated consequence of plan execution. The sixth project is one of the most technically sophisticated and least publicly known of the Cold War's buried programs. Beginning in the late 1950s and accelerating through the 1960s, the United States Army and later DARPA pursued a series of programs aimed at developing what would today be called autonomous battlefield systems. Machines capable of identifying, tracking, and engaging targets without continuous human control. The most advanced of these programs, operating under classifications that have only been partially lifted, involved ground-based sensor and weapons systems designed for deployment along the Iron Curtain that could detect movement, classify it as hostile or neutral using electronic signatures, and engage it with lethal force without requiring a human operator to approve each individual engagement. The program that is most extensively documented in the partially released record is the one associated with the electronic battlefield concept that was first publicly articulated during the Vietnam War, but had roots in Cold War Europe that predate the Vietnam application by nearly a decade. What those European applications looked like in their classified form, what their rules of engagement were, what their error rates were in testing, and how close they came to operational deployment along the German border, remains a matter of significant historical ambiguity. The seventh project involves something that sounds almost mundane until its implications are examined. Throughout the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union maintained what are called continuity of government programs, systems and facilities designed to ensure that governmental authority could survive a nuclear attack. The American program, which has been partially declassified, involved an extraordinary infrastructure of underground facilities, airborne command posts, pre-positioned supplies, and designated successors extending far enough down the chain of command to ensure that someone with legal authority to govern would survive even a comprehensive first strike. What has received considerably less attention is the degree to which these continuity of government programs implicitly acknowledge that the government they were designed to preserve would be governing nothing in any meaningful sense. The population it would nominally represent would be largely dead. The infrastructure it would nominally administer would be largely destroyed. The economic system it would nominally manage would have ceased to exist. The continuity of government program was, in its deepest logic, a program for preserving the legal fiction of governmental authority in conditions where that authority would have no practical content. The people in the bunkers would have titles and succession orders and legal authority over a country that no longer existed in the form those titles presumed. The eighth project reaches into the Soviet Union's own continuity architecture, specifically the system that the Soviets developed in the 1970s and deployed in the 1980s, which became known in the West by the informal name Dead Hand, though its Russian designation was Perimeter. Dead Hand was a semi-automated nuclear launch system designed to ensure Soviet retaliation even if the entire Soviet command structure had been destroyed. The system worked by monitoring for signs of nuclear detonation on Soviet territory. If those signs were detected, and if communications with the Soviet leadership had been severed, the system was designed to automatically transmit launch commands to Soviet strategic forces without requiring human authorization at the decision-making level. Dead Hand was not a secret within the Soviet military establishment. It was a deliberate strategic signal, a way of communicating to the United States that a first strike could not prevent Soviet retaliation because retaliation would be guaranteed by a machine that would survive, even if the men who would normally order it did not. What made Dead Hand extraordinary was not its existence, but its persistence. The system, in some form, continued to exist after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It continued to exist through the 1990s, when Russian nuclear forces were underfunded and under-maintained, and the chain of command that was supposed to manage them was subject to significant institutional uncertainty. Whether Dead Hand exists today, in its original form or some modified version, is not publicly known. The ninth project involves an American program that was less automated than Dead Hand, but that shared its essential logic. The Looking Glass program, which operated continuously from February 1961 to July 1990, involved an airborne command post aircraft, a specially configured aircraft that remained in the air at all times, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 29 years without interruption, carrying the personnel and equipment necessary to command American nuclear forces in the event that ground-based command facilities were destroyed. Looking Glass was not secret in the sense that its existence was classified. It was publicly known. What was not publicly known were the specific authorities that the airborne commander aboard Looking Glass held, the precise conditions under which those authorities could be exercised, and the degree to which the airborne command post had, in practical terms, become a parallel command authority operating alongside rather than strictly subordinate to the terrestrial chain of command. The 10th project is one of the most technically ambitious failures of the Cold War's weapons development history, and it illustrates with particular clarity how the logic of deterrence could produce engineering projects whose implications exceeded what their creators were fully prepared to manage. Project Orion, which ran from 1958 to 1965 under the direction of physicist Freeman Dyson and others at General Atomics, proposed to build a spacecraft propelled by a series of nuclear explosions detonated behind a pusher plate. The physics was sound. The concept would have produced a spacecraft of extraordinary capability, capable of carrying enormous payloads to other planets on timescales measured in years rather than decades. What Orion became, at least in part, was a weapons program. The Air Force, which funded significant portions of the project, was interested in Orion as a platform for delivering nuclear weapons with characteristics that no conventional missile or aircraft could match. An Orion spacecraft could carry a weapons payload of hundreds or thousands of tons. It could operate from orbits that were difficult to intercept, and it could deliver its weapons with a flexibility and redundancy that ground-based missiles could not approximate. The weapons applications of Orion were explored in classified project documents that have been partially released, and what they reveal is that the Air Force was seriously considering a weapons platform whose characteristics would have made it, in the language of the time, a first strike weapon of extraordinary effectiveness. Orion was cancelled in 1965 following the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear detonations in space. The cancellation was presented as a consequence of treaty obligations. What the public record does not fully capture is the degree to which the weapons applications of Orion had already demonstrated their feasibility in theoretical terms, and the degree to which the treaty was seen, within the program, as an obstacle to a weapon system that worked rather than a relief from a weapon system that was dangerous. The 11th project involves the undersea dimension of nuclear deterrence and a program that combined extraordinary technical ambition with a risk profile that has never been fully public. In the early 1960s, the Navy pursued a concept known as the Regulus program and its successors, which involved submarine-launched cruise missiles that would be fired from submarines surfaced in waters relatively close to Soviet territory. The submarines involved would need to surface to launch, making them vulnerable during the launch window, and the missiles themselves, while accurate by the standards of the time, required guidance that involved the submarines remaining in the area for a period after launch. What has received less attention than the Regulus program itself is the classified operational planning that surrounded it, specifically the targeting doctrine that governed which targets the Regulus missiles were assigned to, and under what conditions submarine commanders had authority to launch. The pre-delegation questions that applied to the Air Force's bomber and missile forces applied with equal force to the submarine force, and in the submarine context, they were complicated by the fundamental operational characteristic of submarines, which is that they communicate with difficulty and intermittently and are designed to operate in conditions of communications isolation that are precisely the conditions under which pre-delegation authority might need to be exercised. The 12th project that belongs in this accounting is one that sits at the intersection of psychology and weapons development and represents a dimension of Cold War research that has been more thoroughly suppressed than almost any other. From the late 1940s through the early 1960s, the United States government conducted a series of programs exploring the possibility of using chemical and biological agents not as weapons in the conventional sense, but as tools for altering the behavior, judgment, and decision-making of adversaries. The most extensively documented of these programs is MKUltra, which was partially revealed through congressional investigation in the 1970s. But MKUltra was one program within a larger research enterprise that included programs whose existence has been acknowledged only in outline and whose full operational history may never be recovered because the records were deliberately destroyed. What is known is that the research extended to questions that were extraordinary in their scope. Could an adversary's military command be incapacitated through covert introduction of chemical agents into water supplies? Could a political leader's judgment be altered through drugs administered without their knowledge? Could soldiers be conditioned to respond differently to combat stress through pharmacological intervention? These were not fringe questions asked by marginal figures. They were funded research programs operated by institutions at the center of the American national security establishment, and they produced results, some of which were applied operationally in ways that have never been fully disclosed. The 13th project involves a weapons concept that was seriously considered, partially developed, and then retired without ever being fully acknowledged. Specifically, the development of what planners called enhanced radiation weapons, a category of nuclear device designed to maximize radiation output relative to blast and heat effects. The weapon that most clearly fits this description, and the one that provoked the most public controversy when it was revealed, was the neutron bomb, a thermonuclear device whose design configuration produced a radiation output capable of killing personnel while leaving structures relatively intact. What the public controversy around the neutron bomb, which peaked in the late 1970s, did not fully capture was that enhanced radiation weapons had been under development for considerably longer than the public debate suggested, that they had been incorporated into war planning in ways that preceded the public revelation, and that the debate about whether to produce and deploy them was taking place against the background of a targeting doctrine that had already assigned them specific roles in a conflict scenario. The neutron bomb was presented to the public as a new and disturbing idea. Within the planning community, it was a refinement of an existing concept that had been part of the war plan for years. The 14th project concerns a dimension of the Cold War that receives almost no attention in popular accounts, specifically the planning that both superpowers undertook for the governance and administration of territory following a nuclear exchange. American planning in this area was extensive and has been partially declassified. It included provisions for the declaration of martial law, the suspension of civil liberties, the allocation of surviving resources, the identification and sequestration of individuals whose skills would be prioritized for survival, and the establishment of administrative zones under military authority covering the surviving portions of American territory. What these plans reveal, when examined carefully, is that the planners had made fairly precise estimates of what post-exchange American territory would look like. They had estimated casualty figures. They had estimated infrastructure survival rates. They had estimated agricultural productivity in conditions of partial nuclear winter. And they had designed administrative structures appropriate to those estimates. The structures they designed were not democratic in any meaningful sense. They were command economies under military authority, operating with the legal framework of wartime emergency powers that had been prepared in advance and required only the appropriate triggering event to take effect. The Soviet equivalent of this planning has been less thoroughly documented in Western sources, but what is known from the work of historians who have had access to Soviet archives suggests a parallel structure with similar characteristics. A planned transition from peacetime governance to military administration, pre-positioned resources, designated facilities, and a template for operating a post-nuclear state that assumed a population fraction of the pre-war figure and an economic capacity fraction of the pre-war figure. The 15th project is one of the most technically sophisticated and most thoroughly buried of all the Cold War's concealed programs. Beginning in the 1960s and continuing through the 1980s, the United States pursued a series of programs aimed at developing the capability to destroy Soviet satellites and to defend American satellites against Soviet anti-satellite weapons. The publicly acknowledged portions of this effort include the development of dedicated anti-satellite missiles and the testing of kinetic kill vehicles. What has been less thoroughly acknowledged is the development of directed energy weapons, specifically high-powered laser and particle beam systems for anti-satellite applications. These programs, which operated under classifications that have been only partially lifted, consumed extraordinary resources and produced results that have been acknowledged in the public record only in the vaguest terms. What is known is that by the late 1970s and early 1980s, Both superpowers had ground-based laser systems capable of temporarily blinding or permanently damaging certain categories of satellites, and that operational protocols for using these systems in the opening phases of a conflict had been developed and incorporated into planning documents. The 16th project involves a specific incident that has been partially acknowledged, but whose full dimensions remain unclear, and that serves as a case study in how close the Cold War came to becoming something else. In September 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was on duty at a Soviet early warning facility when the system he was monitoring reported the launch of American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The system reported 1 missile, then 5. Petrov made a judgment call. He reported the detection as a system malfunction rather than as an actual launch. He was correct. The detection was a false alarm caused by sunlight reflecting off clouds in a way that the Soviet satellite sensors misinterpreted as missile exhaust. What the Petrov incident is usually presented as is a story of one man's good judgment preventing nuclear war. What it actually illustrates is something more systemic and more disturbing. The Soviet early warning system, at the moment Petrov was sitting at his console, was a relatively new system that had not been fully tested against real-world conditions. It was producing data that was ambiguous in ways that the system's designers had not fully anticipated. The man responsible for interpreting that data was doing so under conditions of significant stress, with incomplete information, against a background of institutional pressure that favored treating alerts as real rather than dismissing them. Petrov's decision was correct, but it was a human judgment call made in conditions specifically designed to minimize the role of human judgment in favor of rapid and decisive response. The 17th project concerns the weapons that were built but never quite controlled, specifically the category of nuclear weapons known as permissive action links, or PALs, which are the electronic locking systems that prevent nuclear weapons from being armed without proper authorization codes. What is remarkable about permissive action links is not their existence, but their history. For a significant portion of the Cold War, they did not exist. American nuclear weapons were deployed on aircraft, on ships, on submarines, in storage facilities around the world without electronic locks that would prevent unauthorized use. The weapons could be armed by anyone with physical access and the mechanical knowledge to do so. The decision to implement permissive action links was not made quickly or easily. It was resisted within the military establishment on the grounds that locks that prevented unauthorized use might also slow authorized use in a crisis, and that the risk of being unable to use weapons when needed outweighed the risk of someone using them without authorization. This calculation, made by serious people with significant institutional authority, remained the governing logic of American nuclear weapons deployment for longer than most people understand. Permissive action links were gradually implemented through the 1960s and 1970s, but the process was not completed on all weapon systems for a considerable time after the technology was available. The 18th project involves the ocean floor and a program that combined oceanographic research with strategic weapons applications in ways that were not publicly acknowledged at the time and have been only partially acknowledged since. Beginning in the early 1960s, the United States Navy pursued a series of classified programs aimed at exploiting the acoustic properties of the deep ocean for military purposes. The most extensively documented of these is the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, which used hydrophones planted on the ocean floor to detect and track Soviet submarines across vast ocean distances. SOSUS was extraordinarily effective and remained classified for decades. What has received less attention is the broader program of which SOSUS was a part, a program that used the ocean floor as a surveillance, communications, and potentially weapons platform in ways that went beyond hydrophone arrays. The classified record suggests that programs were developed, and in some cases implemented, that treated the ocean floor as a strategic environment in which weapons could be pre-positioned, in which cables and other infrastructure could be sabotaged, and in which autonomous systems could be deployed for purposes that have not been fully described in the available record. The 19th project is one whose existence is documented, but whose operational history remains largely classified. It concerns the development and deployment of nuclear weapons on surface ships other than dedicated aircraft carriers and missile submarines. Throughout the Cold War, American surface warships carried nuclear depth charges, nuclear torpedoes, nuclear-armed anti-submarine rockets, and in some cases nuclear artillery shells and tactical nuclear bombs, in addition to the strategic weapons on submarines and aircraft. What this meant in practical terms was that nuclear weapons were distributed throughout the naval surface force in quantities and locations that were not publicly acknowledged, on ships whose commanding officers had certain pre-delegated authorities that were not publicly described, operating in waters around the world where the potential for confrontation with Soviet naval forces was a routine feature of the operational environment. The collision incidents between American and Soviet surface ships and submarines that occurred throughout the Cold War, some of which resulted in damage to both vessels, took place in an environment where both sides were carrying nuclear weapons and where the rules governing their use under various escalation scenarios were defined in documents that the commanders involved could not fully share with each other. The potential for miscalculation in this environment was not theoretical. It was a persistent feature of the operational reality. The 20th project concerns a specific category of accident that the Cold War produced with a regularity that has never been fully acknowledged in the public record. American nuclear weapons were involved in accidents, crashes, fires, and other incidents throughout the Cold War with a frequency that, had it been publicly known at the time, would have substantially altered the public's understanding of the risk they were living with. The category of incident known as a broken arrow, the military designation for accidents involving nuclear weapons, was documented in internal records and partially acknowledged to the public through a series of official releases over the decades. What those releases showed was a pattern of accidents that included aircraft crashes in which nuclear weapons were lost at sea, fires in which nuclear weapons were damaged, incidents in which weapons fell from aircraft and struck the ground without producing nuclear yields because of safety mechanisms that functioned correctly, and at least one incident in which safety mechanisms partially failed, and a nuclear weapon came closer to detonation than the official account initially acknowledged. The Broken Arrow incident at Goldsboro, North Carolina, in January 1961, in which a B-52 broke apart and released 2 Mark 39 nuclear bombs, is the case that has been most extensively documented in the public record. Documents released decades after the event confirmed that one of the 2 bombs had armed itself during the fall, and that a single low-voltage switch was the only mechanism that prevented detonation. The 21st project involves the specific and largely invisible program that governed how American nuclear planners thought about the Soviet leadership as a target category. The single integrated operational plan, which governed American nuclear forces from 1960 onward, included a target category designated as national leadership, which in plain language meant the Soviet government and military command structure. The planning for this target category evolved over the decades of the Cold War in ways that reflect the broader evolution of American nuclear doctrine. But one dimension of this planning has received less attention than it deserves. The Soviet leadership was well aware that it was a target category. The awareness of this fact shaped Soviet behavior throughout the Cold War in ways that are documented but not always fully appreciated. The Soviets invested heavily in hardened command facilities, in dispersal plans for senior leadership, in communication systems designed to function through nuclear attack, and in continuity arrangements that paralleled and in some ways exceeded the American equivalents. And they invested in dead hand, precisely because they understood that if the leadership was destroyed in a first strike, the ability to retaliate needed to be guaranteed by something that survived the destruction of the leadership. The American targeting of Soviet leadership was therefore a direct cause of the development of a Soviet system designed to retaliate without leadership. The 22nd project involves the final years of the Cold War and a program that illustrates how the system's internal logic continued to produce extraordinary outcomes even as the political environment was changing. In the mid-1980s, as Mikhail Gorbachev was beginning the political reforms that would eventually end the Cold War, the United States was pursuing a research program known publicly as the Strategic Defense Initiative and privately by a range of more specific classified designations depending on which component of the program was being discussed. The public version of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was announced by President Reagan in March 1983, envisioned a comprehensive missile defense system that would render nuclear weapons obsolete by intercepting them before they could reach American territory. What the public version of the Strategic Defense Initiative did not capture was the degree to which the program's classified components were exploring first strike enhancement as much as defense. A missile defense system that could intercept a Soviet retaliatory strike would be strategically equivalent to a first strike capability. If the United States could destroy most of the Soviet arsenal in a first strike and then intercept the remainder with missile defenses, it would have achieved a genuine nuclear superiority that would fundamentally alter the strategic balance. Soviet planners understood this perfectly and responded with alarm and with countermeasures, including the development of additional warheads, maneuvering re-entry vehicles, and penetration aids specifically designed to defeat missile defenses. The Soviet response to the Strategic Defense Initiative was, from the Soviet perspective, entirely rational, and it illustrates the central paradox that ran through the entire Cold War. Every program designed to enhance security produced a response that reduced security. Every system designed to prevent the other side from striking first created an incentive for the other side to strike first before the system was complete. The logic of deterrence was not a stable equilibrium. It was a dynamic process that generated its own momentum, and that momentum was in the direction of escalation regardless of the intentions of the people managing it. The 23rd project is not a single program, but a category of program. The category of programs that existed at the boundary between what was authorized and what was not. Programs that were run by people who believed they were acting within their authority, but who were operating in an environment where authority was sufficiently ambiguous that this belief could not be verified. The history of the Cold War contains documented cases of officers who took actions with nuclear weapons or nuclear-capable systems that exceeded or potentially exceeded their explicit authorization, acting on their understanding of what they were supposed to do in circumstances that their orders had not fully anticipated. The most extensively documented of these cases involves the events of October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was being pursued by American naval forces and was unable to communicate with Moscow. The submarine was carrying a nuclear torpedo with explicit authorization requirements that could not be met because communications were severed. The decision about whether to fire the torpedo was made by 3 officers, and 2 of them voted to fire. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, voted against. The vote required unanimity. The torpedo was not fired. Arkhipov is sometimes described as the man who saved the world. The description is probably accurate, but what the description does not capture is the institutional reality that produced the situation. The Soviet submarine was in waters where American forces were conducting aggressive anti-submarine operations. It was out of communications. It had a weapon whose use required authorization that could not be obtained. The officers aboard made a decision in conditions of genuine uncertainty about whether they were under attack, about what their orders required them to do, and about what the consequences of action or inaction would be. They made the right decision. But the system had placed them in a position where the wrong decision was entirely plausible, and where the outcome would have depended not on the wisdom of institutions, but on the judgment of individuals in a submarine hull under depth charges far from any source of guidance. That is the pattern that runs through every one of these 23 projects. Not malice, not irrationality, not the failure of intelligence or the absence of good intentions. The pattern is a system that was designed with great care and considerable expertise to manage an unprecedented strategic situation, and that in managing that situation created conditions in which catastrophe was routine as a possibility, in which the margin between accident and disaster was measured in individual decisions made by individuals who were not always in a position to make them well, and in which the logic of the system itself generated pressures that moved constantly toward the edge. The Cold War did not end because these systems were resolved. It ended because the Soviet Union dissolved. The weapons remained. The procedures remained. The targeting plans were revised but not retired. The submarines continued their patrols. The early warning systems continued their watch. The continuity of government bunkers were maintained. Dead hand, in some form, continued to exist. The infrastructure of mutual assured destruction did not dissolve when the political entity that had created one half of it ceased to exist. It persisted, in modified form, in the hands of a Russian state that was for a period genuinely uncertain about its own institutional coherence, and in the hands of an American state that had spent 40 years building systems designed to function without human judgment, and had not, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War's end, found a compelling reason to dismantle them. The war that was never declared ended without a peace treaty. The systems that sustained it did not receive a formal decommissioning. The documents that described them were reclassified or destroyed or placed in archives that will not be fully opened for decades. The men and women who built and operated these systems retired, and in many cases took their specific knowledge with them when they died. What remains in the public record is a partial accounting, a set of silhouettes against a background that has not been fully illuminated, suggesting a shape whose full dimensions cannot be seen from where we currently stand. The Cold War was not mostly peaceful. It was mostly silent, and the silence was not the silence of safety. It was the silence of systems operating according to their own logic, in classified channels, beyond the range of public understanding, rehearsing an outcome that was never supposed to happen, but was never successfully made impossible.